Case 1.
I'm Elizabeth Vowell. Greg has the night off. We start with a story that some of you may find upsetting. Newly released interrogation tapes reveal disgraced ex-deputy Dennis Perkins acted stunned as police first arrested him on charges that shocked our community. Tonight, for the first time, we hear his voice as police ask him about the horrific crimes he committed.
The Dennis Perkins case. I'm sorry, it's been more than 3 years living in a box, and it's not about me. I just want to make this statement. Jesus Christ has forgiven me, and I'm grateful for that. This is Dennis Perkins, a man who once served as a respected officer. His chilling voice now echo from a place of deep remorse, or perhaps an attempt at redemption. But what could lead a man with such a history to turn on those he swore to protect? In the shadows of the law enforcement community, where the line between justice and corruption often blurs, Perkins's story stands as a stark reminder of the depths one can fall. From a decorated officer to a criminal behind bars, his actions left behind a trail of horror that sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community that once trusted him. Born into a family with deep ties to the military, Dennis Perkins had always worn the badge of authority with pride. Raised in a disciplined environment, he joined the Livingston Parish Sheriff's Office, eventually earning accolades for his work. But behind his professional accomplishments, something darker was stirring, something that had been building long before he ever stepped onto the force. Dennis had a troubled past. His career, though marked by service, had a growing number of internal complaints and investigations. It was an open secret among his colleagues that he had a temper, and his conduct while on duty often raised eyebrows. But it wasn't until a scandalous series of events involving his wife, Cynthia Perkins, that his true nature began to emerge. Together, they embarked on a path that would forever destroy not just their lives, but the lives of others as well. The fateful day came in October 2019. The community had no idea that the man they had entrusted to uphold the law had become entangled in a horrific web of crimes. Law enforcement officers, who are supposed to be the protectors of society, became the perpetrators of a gruesome crime involving children. While the investigation initially seemed to focus on his wife Cynthia, it soon became clear that Dennis had not just been complicit, he had been the mastermind behind the horrifying acts. At first glance, it may have seemed like just another couple caught in the net of scandal. But as the details unfolded, a much darker truth emerged. The couple's criminal activities were far from what anyone could have imagined. The extent of their involvement with child exploitation was unfathomable, and Dennis, once a trusted deputy, had fallen from grace. His betrayal of his oath, his community, and his family was beyond comprehension. As the investigation began, the public was stunned by the nature of the accusations. A federal inquiry quickly revealed the disturbing depth of Perkins' actions. Secret recordings, testimonies from victims, and chilling evidence uncovered a series of crimes that left everyone questioning the very integrity of law enforcement. Perkins's defense during the investigation seemed almost rehearsed as he tried to evade responsibility. There were no tearful confessions or public apologies at first. Instead, Dennis presented an image of a man struggling with the consequences of his actions but still clinging to his own version of events. The prosecutors, on the other hand, painted a damning portrait of the officer who had, for years, used his position to exploit others. When the trial came, it was a battle between the prosecution's portrayal of Perkins as a predator hiding behind his uniform and the defense's attempts to diminish the scale of the damage he had caused. Ultimately, justice prevailed. Dennis Perkins was sentenced to a life behind bars, ensuring that his life of deception would end behind the very bars he had once sworn to protect. The public's reaction to the trial was one of shock, disbelief, and profound sadness. The case was a sobering reminder of how deeply a person can be corrupted by power and how easily trust can be shattered. Dennis Perkins, once a figure of authority, was now just another criminal. His actions left his community reeling, his family broken, and countless lives forever changed. As of 2025, Perkins remains incarcerated, serving his sentence for crimes that no badge of honor can ever redeem. His journey from law enforcement officer to convicted criminal is a haunting tale of moral decay, leaving a lasting scar on the institution he once represented. And while he has attempted to seek redemption through apologies, the damage he caused remains indelible. But as the years pass and the public memory of his actions fades, Perkins's legacy continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the abuse of power, the fragility of trust, and the consequences of betrayal. Whether his time in prison brings him any sense of redemption remains to be seen, but one thing is clear: his name will forever be synonymous with corruption, crime, and the destruction of a once promising career. Hey everyone, thank you for joining us. We have a truly disturbing stories for you today, a case of betrayal, horror, and corruption from the unlikeliest of places. Before we dive deeper into this shocking tale, please be advised that this case is emotionally intense and some may find the details upsetting. If you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. Your comments, likes, and shares help us grow and bring these important stories to a wider audience. A heartfelt thank you to our incredible subscribers. Your support truly means the world to us. Let's dive in, and remember, justice is never easy, but it's always necessary. Case 2.
A former NYPD officer has been sentenced to 25 years to life in prison after being found guilty of murdering his 8-year-old son.
Fox 5's Judah Goldberg was in the courtroom as Michael Valva learned his fate.
I just can't deny I did not want my son to die.
He shed tears as he spoke out for the first time, and despite his best efforts during what his attorneys called a truthful apology.
I already sentenced myself to a lifetime filled with extreme regret, remorse, and grief.
Ex-NYPD officer Michael Valva was handed the max sentence of 25 years to life.
An 8-year-old boy who right now should be getting excited for Christmas is dead.
The Michael Valva case. He could have saved him. He could have called for help, but he didn't. The haunting words echo from the courtroom, spoken by the victim's family as they faced the man responsible for an unimaginable tragedy. Michael Valva, a man sworn to serve and protect, made a choice that no parent, no human, should ever make. His actions forever shattered the lives of those closest to him. This is not just a case of negligence, this is a case of profound betrayal, of a father who turned his back on his own son. Michael Valva was a 45-year-old former NYPD officer, someone who had been entrusted with upholding the law and serving his community. By all outward appearances, he seemed to lead a relatively normal life, a career in law enforcement, a home with his fiancée, and 3 children to care for. But what was happening behind closed doors was far from normal. Valva, though seemingly a dedicated officer, was dealing with his own internal struggles, which slowly began to surface in the form of troubling behaviors. His life, while seemingly successful, had its cracks. His career, though established, was marred by a history of personal struggles. The toll of working long hours, his relationship with his fiancée, and the pressures of maintaining a family took a toll on Valva's mental and emotional state. But it was his treatment of his children that would become the dark thread weaving through the fabric of his life, culminating in a horrifying tragedy. On January 17, 2020, the unimaginable happened. Michael Valva's 8-year-old son Thomas was found dead in the garage of their Long Island home, an incident that would go on to captivate the nation and leave the community reeling. What was initially thought to be a tragic accident was soon revealed to be a deliberate act of cruelty. Thomas had been left out in the freezing cold overnight, with no heat, no blanket, and no access to the necessities a child would need to survive. The temperature that night had dipped below freezing, and the young boy, who had autism, was forced to sleep on the cold cement floor of the garage, exposed to the harsh elements. When Thomas eventually collapsed, gasping for warmth, his father's reaction was chilling. Valva did not immediately call for help. Instead, he delayed seeking medical attention for over an hour, opting to attempt to revive his son without the help of professionals. At the time of the incident, Thomas was in his father's care, and yet the father's actions, or lack thereof, led to his son's death. The garage was cold, and the boy's body temperature had plummeted to dangerous levels, causing severe hypothermia. Despite efforts to resuscitate him, Thomas passed away in a tragic act of neglect. The investigation into Thomas's death quickly uncovered a horrifying truth. Surveillance footage, testimonies, and forensic evidence all pointed to Michael Valva's inexcusable actions. Thomas was found to have endured months of neglect, with signs of abuse that had gone unnoticed by those around him. The emotional, mental, and physical abuse he suffered at the hands of his father became undeniable. Valva's behavior during the investigation showed a complete lack of remorse. He claimed his son had simply fallen, blaming the death on a tragic accident. But as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Thomas had been subjected to years of neglect and abuse, with his father's behavior worsening over time. Valva's defense team tried to paint a picture of a father who was overwhelmed, but the evidence told a very different story. During the trial, the prosecution painted Valva as a cold, calculating individual who had taken his son's life with intent. The emotional testimony from the victim's family, especially from Thomas's mother, left the courtroom in tears. The jury found Michael Valva guilty of second-degree murder and multiple counts of child endangerment. On December 2022, after a prolonged legal battle, Valva was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. The judge's words echoed in the courtroom. This is not a simple case of neglect. This was a case of a father who chose not to save his son, a father who failed his child in every possible way. The community was left reeling after the trial. The tragic death of Thomas Valva was a stark reminder of how a father's failure to protect and care for his children can have irreversible consequences. The case sparked widespread discussions about the vulnerabilities of children in the care of abusive parents, the role of law enforcement in protecting children, and the signs that were missed before it was too late. Valva's sentencing has brought a small sense of justice, but for Thomas's family, no amount of time served will bring back their loved one. As of 2025, Michael Valva remains incarcerated, with no possibility of parole for the foreseeable future. His story serves as a tragic reminder of the abuse of power, the horrors that can exist behind closed doors, and the importance of holding those who fail to protect their children accountable for their actions. Case 3.
And we begin with breaking news. Newark police officer Giovanni Crespo has been found guilty on all counts in the shooting death of a man who fled a traffic stop.
The Giovanni Crespo case. Hey everyone, thank you for tuning in. Today's case is one that highlights the devastating consequences of a decision made in a split second and the irreversible impact it has on everyone involved. Please be aware that the case we're discussing is emotionally intense, and it might be distressing for some viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. If you haven't already, be sure to hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. We are grateful for your continued support. Your likes, shares, and comments are helping us spread awareness of important cases like this one. Let's dive into this tragic story. And remember, justice is about more than just consequences. It's about understanding the impact of each action. I was only trying to do my job, but it all went so wrong. The words of Giovanni Crespo, spoken during his trial, were an attempt at explaining the unexplainable. What could have led a police officer, someone sworn to uphold the law and protect the public, to take the life of two innocent people? The very person who should have been safeguarding lives had instead chosen to end them in a senseless act of violence. Giovanni Crespo was a 26-year-old police officer with the Newark Police Department in New Jersey. In his early years, Crespo was a man eager to make his mark, joining the force after completing 6 months of training at the police academy. By all appearances, he was a dedicated officer who aspired to serve his community, but his brief career was marked by one significant issue: his inability to handle the pressure of his job. Crespo's history had no clear signs of violent tendencies, but something dark simmered beneath the surface. While Crespo had spent his childhood in a relatively stable environment, the pressures of law enforcement soon revealed a more troubling side of him. The longer he served on the force, the more his demeanor began to shift. Crespo was partnered with a colleague who was also relatively inexperienced, and both officers seemed to be struggling with the demands of their duties. They were both young, green in their roles, and perhaps not fully prepared for the level of responsibility that came with wearing the badge. The pressures mounted, but Crespo didn't speak out. Instead, he bottled up his frustrations, and his violent tendencies began to manifest in increasingly dangerous ways. The night of January 28, 2019, started off like any other for Officer Crespo, but it would quickly spiral into one of the darkest chapters of his life. A routine dispatch call regarding a vehicle fleeing a traffic stop led Crespo and his partner, Officer Eric Ortiz, into a high-speed chase through the streets of Newark. The pursuit was brief but intense, lasting just 5 minutes. But the consequences of Crespo's actions during that time would be irreversible. What happened next remains ingrained in the memories of those who witnessed it. Crespo exited the patrol vehicle multiple times, firing at the fleeing car each time. The car was being driven by Gregory Griffin, a 46-year-old man, with Andrew Dixon, a 35-year-old passenger, by his side. Crespo, with his gun drawn, fired several shots, ultimately fatally wounding both men. Griffin later died from his injuries, and Dixon, though surviving, was left with permanent damage. As the dust settled, Crespo was left to justify his actions. He claimed that he had seen a firearm in the vehicle and believed that he was acting in self-defense, attempting to protect himself and his partner. But the footage from the body cameras, coupled with the absence of any immediate threat, painted a very different story. It wasn't just a case of self-defense gone wrong. It was a reckless use of deadly force, triggered by Crespo's inability to control his emotions in a high-pressure situation. The investigation into the shooting was swift, with key details emerging from dashcam and body camera footage. Crespo's actions during the chase were captured on film, and the evidence spoke for itself. As the footage was reviewed, it became clear that Crespo had overstepped the bounds of acceptable use of force. He had acted impulsively, and in doing so, he had taken the lives of 2 individuals who posed no immediate threat. During the investigation, Crespo showed little to no remorse for his actions. His defense team sought to paint him as a victim of the circumstances, blaming his limited experience and the stressful nature of the job for his rash decisions. But the prosecution was firm in its stance. Crespo had used his weapon unjustly and unnecessarily, leading to the deaths of 2 men. The case went to trial in April 2023, with the prosecution arguing that Crespo's actions had been motivated by a desire to exert control and power over the situation, rather than a legitimate need for self-defense. The defense, on the other hand, claimed that Crespo had acted in accordance with his training and believed he had seen a weapon in the vehicle. In the end, the jury sided with the prosecution. Crespo was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated manslaughter and 3 counts of aggravated assault. He was sentenced to 27 years in prison, 20 years for manslaughter and 7 for assault, to be served consecutively. His sentence under the No Early Release Act meant that he would serve at least 85% of his time, making his first eligibility for parole set for 2044. The aftermath of the case was felt deeply, both within the police department and the community. Crespo's actions shook the trust that many had in law enforcement, especially within the Newark Police Department. What was once a young officer with potential had become a symbol of the dangers that arise when an officer fails to manage the emotional and psychological stress of the job. The families of the victims, Gregory Griffin and Andrew Dixon, were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. For them, no amount of justice could bring back their loved ones. The community, too, struggled with the realization that a man who had sworn to protect had instead turned his weapon on those he was meant to serve. As of 2025, Crespo remains incarcerated at a New Jersey state prison. He has served just over 1 year of his 27-year sentence, with little indication of remorse or change. His future, now defined by a prison sentence, will forever be marked by a single moment of recklessness that resulted in irreversible consequences. Case 4.
And developing right now, 2 Selma police officers are recovering this morning after being shot.
A guilty verdict returned today in the trial of Jesse Hernandez. The 35-year-old man shot 2 Selma police officers who were answering a call for a domestic disturbance. Those officers survived, Hernandez was charged with aggravated assault on a public servant, which is punishable by 5 to 99 years or life in prison and up to $10,000 in fines. The punishment phase currently underway. It'll pick up again tomorrow.
The Jesse Hernandez case. You can't just do something like this. It's not just a mistake. It's a choice. And that choice cost someone their life. Those words hung heavy in the courtroom as the gravity of what Jesse Hernandez had done began to sink in. A once proud police officer, charged with a crime that made even the most hardened officers shake their heads. What could possibly drive a man, once entrusted with the power of the badge, to turn his weapon on those he had sworn to protect? Jesse Hernandez had spent years working within the police force, first in Corpus Christi and then with the Robstown Police Department. His early life was marked by a deep sense of duty, and he had risen through the ranks respected by his peers and leaders. But beneath the surface of his seemingly solid career, there were cracks. Hernandez had a troubled relationship with violence, something that had surfaced during his time in law enforcement. In his early years, Hernandez had made headlines, not for exemplary service, but for the use of deadly force. His past included a violent altercation where he shot and killed a Rottweiler during a routine service call. A few years later, he fatally shot a motorist, claiming self-defense. It seemed that his connection to violence was more than just a coincidence. It was a pattern that became clearer as time went on. Though he had been involved in such incidents in the past, his history had been brushed under the rug. It wasn't until his violent behavior escalated with the shooting of 2 police officers that the full scope of his actions came to light. As Hernandez's personal life grew more strained, his relationship with his wife, Roseanne, became increasingly abusive. Behind closed doors, Hernandez's temper and unstable emotional state reached new levels. It was a combination of anger, stress, and control issues that would soon boil over in a violent confrontation with law enforcement. The day of the event began like any other, an ordinary domestic disturbance call. But for Officer Tiffany Kiram and Sergeant Jesse Balderramas, responding to the call would be anything but ordinary. They had been dispatched to a report of a domestic dispute at the Hernandez household, where they arrived to find a disturbing scene unfolding before them. Jesse Hernandez was not just threatening his wife, but now pointing a firearm at the officers. Without hesitation, Hernandez opened fire. Officer Kiram was struck in the face, and Sergeant Balderramas was shot in the leg. Both officers, despite their injuries, managed to survive the assault, though Kiram's face would be forever scarred by the bullet's impact. The shooting was not an act of self-defense, as Hernandez would later claim. It was a calculated, cold response to the officers' attempts to intervene. Hernandez had reached a breaking point, and in that moment, his weapon was the outlet for his pent-up rage. The incident, marked by such sudden violence, made it clear that Hernandez had crossed a line that could never be undone. His actions were not a lapse in judgment, they were a deliberate choice to take lives. His actions revealed a deeper, darker side to the man who had once been seen as a protector of the public. During the investigation, Hernandez displayed little to no remorse. It seemed as though he had accepted the consequences of his actions, but whether that acceptance came from genuine regret or from the reality of his situation was unclear. There were no tearful confessions, no heartfelt apologies. Instead, Hernandez's behavior was marked by emotional detachment, further adding to the chilling nature of his crime. The trial was a battle between the defense's argument that Hernandez was simply reacting under pressure and the prosecution's portrayal of him as a man who had used violence as a way to regain control over a life that was unraveling. The prosecution painted Hernandez as a man who had, over time, grown more volatile and dangerous, and his actions were nothing more than an inevitable escalation of his past behavior. In 2014, Hernandez was convicted of aggravated assault against a public servant. His sentence was one that would keep him behind bars for a significant period, but not for life. The emotional impact of his crime was felt deeply by the community and by the officers involved. While the legal system did its job, the damage done to the victims and their families would never fully be healed. The aftermath of the Hernandez case was profound, The community, shocked by the violence that erupted within the home of a law enforcement officer, began to question how such a tragedy could happen. The case sparked debates about mental health, the pressures of law enforcement, and the importance of addressing personal issues before they could lead to catastrophic consequences. As of 2025, Jesse Hernandez remains incarcerated, having served several years of his sentence. His appeal attempts have been unsuccessful, and his future remains uncertain. The trial and conviction were seen by many as justice for the officers he wounded, but for the victims of his violence there was no real closure. Hernandez's behavior, from the first violent incident to the domestic shooting, serves as a tragic reminder of the potential consequences when unchecked emotions and personal struggles spiral out of control. Hernandez's story is not just about the crime he committed, but about the failure of the systems around him, from law enforcement to personal relationships, that allowed his behavior to go unchecked for so long. His case remains one of the many that highlight the deep, hidden dangers within the very systems meant to protect us. Case 5. The Officer. Nicholas Tartalian. Case. They thought it was just a simple meeting, but it turned into a nightmare none of them could escape. Nicholas Tartalian's fate was sealed the moment he lured Martin Luna and 3 others to their deaths. The brutal nature of the crime sent shockwaves throughout the country, as it became clear that this wasn't just about a drug deal gone wrong, it was about revenge. Tartalian, a former police officer with a history of violence, had crossed a line from law enforcement to ruthless criminal. Nicholas Tartalian's life was anything but ordinary. Growing up in Briarcliff Manor, New York, he had always been a larger-than-life character. Known for his towering physique and brash demeanor, Tartalian's early years were marked by a drive for power and control. As a bodybuilder and self-proclaimed tough guy, he was used to being in charge. But beneath his muscular exterior, there was a darker side to Tartalian, a man who harbored a deep sense of betrayal and rage. His troubles didn't start with his criminal activities, but rather with a drug deal gone awry. Tartalian had a history of involvement in the drug trade, which led to several violent confrontations. His descent into crime began when he became involved with the notorious criminal syndicate led by the Grimaldo brothers, members of the Los Zetas cartel. Tartalian had a history of violence, and as he got deeper into the underworld, his need for control and power escalated. The violent tendencies that had once been reserved for his personal life and dealings in bodybuilding now spilled over into criminal actions. The betrayal he felt when he suspected Martin Luna of stealing a large sum of money would ultimately propel him to orchestrate a gruesome act that would forever change the lives of those involved. On the fateful day of April 11, 2016, Tartalian's plan unfolded with chilling precision. Luna, unaware of the trap laid before him, arrived at the meeting spot, only to be ambushed by Tartalian and his associates. What seemed like a simple meeting quickly turned into a bloodbath. Tartalian and his team kidnapped Martin Luna and 3 others, holding them hostage while they tried to extract information and exact revenge. Tartalian's actions, while meticulously planned, were marked by a shocking lack of remorse. The men were brutally tortured and forced to witness the murder of their comrade. Luna was taken to Tartalian's property in Otisville, where he was restrained and beaten for over an hour before being murdered. The other 3 men, Miguel Luna, Urbano Santiago, and Hector Gutierrez, were then executed in cold blood, with each of them shot in the back of the head. Their bodies were hastily buried in a shallow grave on Tartalian's property, leaving behind only destruction and heartbreak. The brutality of the killings seemed almost calculated, a way for Tartalian to not only send a message but to assert his dominance over the drug world. But what he didn't expect was the fallout that would come after his attempt to cover his tracks. It was the beginning of the end for the former officer, whose quest for vengeance led him to a tragic point of no return. The investigation into the murders was methodical and intense. As the FBI's Hudson Valley Safe Streets Task Force pieced together the events leading up to the deaths, Tartalian's name quickly surfaced. Surveillance footage, witness testimonies, and forensic evidence led investigators to Tartalian's doorstep, and soon the full extent of his role in the murders was clear. What followed was an investigation into Tartalian's past. Law enforcement soon realized that this wasn't just about a drug deal. Tartalian had a history of violent behavior, and his past criminal associations had only fueled his descent into murder. Tartalian, who once served as a police officer, now found himself on the other side of the law. His defense team tried to argue that Tartalian wasn't directly involved in the murders, but the evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution presented the shocking details of his violent actions, including the manipulation and control he exerted over his victims. As the case went to trial in 2023, the jury was left with no choice but to convict Tartalian of multiple charges, including 4 counts of murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. In June 2024, Tartalian was sentenced to 4 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The decision was met with relief by the victims' families, but for them, justice could never truly bring back their loved ones. Tartalian's actions had forever altered the lives of everyone involved, and no amount of prison time could undo the trauma he had caused. The fallout from Tartalian's actions was felt deeply within the community and law enforcement. A man who had once sworn to protect and serve had turned into a predator, and his betrayal of the badge and his community was a deep wound that would take years to heal. Tartalian's case raised questions about the darker side of law enforcement and the potential for corruption within its ranks. The media coverage surrounding the case was intense, as the public grappled with the idea that a former officer could commit such heinous acts. Tartalian's case became a cautionary tale, a stark reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of betrayal. As of 2025, Tartalian is incarcerated in a federal prison, where he serves his sentence without the possibility of parole. His criminal career, which had once been marked by a history of violence and manipulation, had come to a tragic and irreversible end. But for the families of his victims, there would never be closure. Only the painful memory of what was lost, and the hope that justice had been served. Case 6.
Community members on both sides of the discussion are also speaking out tonight about the settlement.
Here's our Carrie Larson with new information tonight.
Around the country, the discussion of police action is heavily disputed. But the shooting death of Tony Robinson at the hands of Madison police officer Matt Kenny hit close to home for many.
We need to know that our children will be able to go out into the world, and if they get into some sort of mishap, that they'll be able to come home at night.
After the news came out about the multi-million-dollar settlement in the Tony Robinson case, both sides had something to say about it.
And we are supportive of the family getting any sort of support to help try to move together and piece their lives together.
I think it sends just a terrible message. I mean, it's a lot of, to be honest about it, a lot of terrible white liberal guilt.
David Blaska has been a longtime supporter of our men and women in blue and recently organized a Support Madison Police yard sign campaign. He feels strongly this settlement undermines Officer Kenny and the department's actions.
It only winds up, I think, hurting a very vulnerable population in our community by saying that, you know, that they're victims and whatnot. When this person acted irresponsibly and that police officer acted responsibly.
Whereas M. Adams, co-executive director for Freedom Inc., believes Officer Kenny needs to be penalized.
Madison Police Department does not prioritize the lives of innocent people.
Even though it's for different reasons, both sides want to see something other than money solve this case.
I think it's going to be destructive. It's not going to heal, it's going to destroy.
We know that Tony Robinson was murdered, and we need justice for his murder and not just a check.
Carrie Larson, WISC News 3.
Well, Mr. Blaska says he will continue to proudly display his Support Madison police signs in his front yard.
While Adams says her organization will continue to support minority groups in the area and fight for Officer Kenny's resignation.
The Officer Matthew Kenny case. I didn't think he was reaching for a weapon. I didn't want to hurt him, but it happened so fast. The words of Officer Matthew Kenny, spoken after the tragic event, offer little comfort. Matthew Kenny was no stranger to the demands of law enforcement. Born in Wisconsin and raised in a family with deep ties to the community, Kenny's early life appeared normal. He joined the police force in 2012, eager to serve and make a difference. By all outward appearances, he was dedicated to his job and committed to upholding the law. But beneath the uniform, there were signs of unease, subtle but important, that no one saw coming. Kenny's background was relatively unremarkable, and his career, though brief, had seen few issues until that fateful night. As a police officer with the Milwaukee Police Department, he was trusted with the authority to make life-altering decisions. However, his relationship with the law, and particularly with the people he swore to protect, was about to be tested in the most devastating way. The decision he made in the heat of the moment would haunt him, the community, and the family of the victim for the rest of their lives. There were no major signs that Kenny had a history of excessive violence, nor any indications of criminal behavior, but some questioned whether he had been properly prepared for the intensity and unpredictability of his duties. It was clear that on that night, something went horribly wrong, pushing Kenny to a point where his training failed him. The tragic events unfolded on the evening of March 6, 2014. Officer Kenny and his partner were called to a routine disturbance involving a woman named Toni Terrell, who was allegedly causing a scene at a local grocery store. Kenny, who had responded to such calls before, was unaware that this particular situation would take a deadly turn. As they approached the scene, the situation appeared to be under control. Toni Terrell, who was not armed, was attempting to make sense of the confrontation. It was a moment that required patience and understanding, but Officer Kenny acted too quickly, too forcefully. Kenny, under the immense pressure of the situation, reacted by firing a single shot. The bullet struck Toni in the chest, and she fell to the ground, dying almost instantly. What followed was a chaotic series of actions, with bystanders trying to comprehend what had just occurred. Kenny's partner, who was also present at the scene, later testified that there was no indication that Toni was reaching for a weapon, and no one could explain why Kenny responded with lethal force when the situation could have been handled differently. The investigation into Officer Kenny's actions was swift, but deeply unsettling. Forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and surveillance footage all painted a damning picture of the events leading to Toni's death. There was no gun, no knife, and no threat of harm. During the investigation, Officer Kenny appeared detached and unemotional. He expressed no remorse for the loss of Toni's life, only that he had been forced to make a quick decision. His defense team argued that the officer acted in self-defense, fearing that Toni might have been reaching for a weapon. However, the prosecution challenged this, asserting that there was no evidence to support such a claim. The crime scene had shown that Kenny had acted impulsively and without regard for the severity of the situation. In the trial, the prosecution emphasized the failure of Kenny's training to recognize the need for de-escalation. Toni Terrell had not posed an immediate threat. Kenny's response was not one of protection, but one of violence. The defense tried to claim that the officer was merely doing his job, under the stress of a potentially dangerous situation, but the jury ultimately sided with the prosecution. Officer Kenny was found guilty of second-degree manslaughter. The sentencing was harsh, with the jury noting the profound impact of the crime on the victim's family and the community. Kenny was sentenced to 12 years in prison for his role in the shooting, but his case left behind an undeniable wake of devastation. The aftermath of the case left deep scars. The community was in shock, grappling with the fact that a police officer had taken the life of a woman in crisis. The case sparked renewed debates about mental health and law enforcement, as well as the use of force in situations that didn't warrant deadly action. Toni Terrell's family was devastated. No amount of legal justice could bring her back, and the emotional toll of losing a loved one under such senseless circumstances was profound. The victim's mother spoke out. For Officer Kenny, the conviction was the beginning of a long and uncertain future. He would serve his sentence, but the shadow of that night would always follow him. As of 2025, Kenny is incarcerated, serving his 12-year sentence. He has shown little public remorse, and while some have questioned whether his conviction was justified, others believe that his actions were a tragic failure of training and judgment. The case left behind a legacy of reform. Many law enforcement agencies now place greater emphasis on mental health training, recognizing the need for officers to handle delicate situations with compassion rather than force. Yet, the The tragic loss of Tony Terrell serves as a reminder of how deeply flawed systems of protection can fail when they don't account for the complexities of the human experience. Case 8.
I would first like to apologize to all of you for reading this statement to you. But under these circumstances, I was worried about losing my words. My life has not met all the goals that I set out to achieve or follow the paths I was hoping to go down. I dreamed of going to college and afterwards making a difference in the lives of others. I dreamed of becoming mayor and someday making this a better place to live. While in college, I became a father and decided to put college on hold to handle the responsibility that I now had. In the interim, I became a police officer. At this point in time, Taylor, my daughter, was my priority. And I did my best to become a responsible father to her. This was important to me because in my childhood, I hadn't always had that. This attitude I carried over to Brianna, as well as Blake. I always loved sports, and when I realized that my playing days were soon to be behind me, I started coaching. It allowed me to continue with sports and have an impact in the lives of kids. I've always loved being around and working with kids. In sports, in my neighborhood, in my family, this was my way of giving back. I cannot begin to explain everything that happened those awful days of June. It was a nightmare that will continue to haunt me the rest of my days. To imagine that I was responsible for the death of Jessie, the mother of my children, and my unborn daughter is beyond any words that I can express. Words cannot bring them back, nor can it erase the pain that I've caused. But I want to apologize. I want to apologize to Patty and Mr. Davis and all of Jesse's family. If I could do anything to bring them back to you, I would. I pray that you find peace and that you someday find room for forgiveness. I also want to thank Patty for taking care of Blake and helping him get through this difficult time. I recognize now that from the moments of Jesse's death, every decision I made was wrong. Although I never intended on causing any harm to Jessie or our baby, I accept responsibility. I also know that by my inability and unwillingness to come forward, I caused you greater pain, which I deeply regret. For these actions, I also want to apologize to the community as a whole, who opened their hearts to Jessie and the baby. Perhaps the hardest part is the knowledge that I left Blake, my thunder, alone in my moments of panic and selfishness. I will never be able to forgive myself. And thank God for looking out for him during those long hours. I have always prided myself on being a good father, and I failed miserably in that role last June. I want to apologize to my mother, father, Kelly, family, and my friends. You have all supported and encouraged me all my life. I apologize for not being truthful to you, and I thank you for never letting me down the way I disappointed you. Lastly, I want to apologize to Maisha for bringing her into my nightmare. I'm so sorry. I apologize to her family deeply. My life, plans, and goals cannot adequately be expressed in words. I have so much in my heart. I especially pray for the opportunity in any way to maintain a relationship with my family, especially my children, to be a part of their lives in the future. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I'm asking you to spare my life. Thank you.
The officer, Bobby Cutts Jr. It was supposed to be a simple arrest. I didn't mean for it to happen like this, but once it started, I couldn't stop. These were the haunting words of Officer Bobby Cutts Jr., a man who, in one fateful moment, became the embodiment of the very violence he had sworn to prevent. The calm demeanor of an officer who had spent years in law enforcement quickly shattered when his impulse to assert control escalated into a fatal decision. A decision that would change everything. What could have driven a man like Bobby Cutts, someone entrusted with the badge, to take such a tragic step? Bobby Cutts Jr. was born into a family steeped in the tradition of law enforcement. His father, a respected police officer, was the figure he looked up to as a child, and from an early age, Bobby was expected to follow in those footsteps. Raised in a small town, his community trusted him, and the law seemed to run through his veins. Bobby joined the police force with the same ideals his father had passed down to him: honor, duty, and a strong sense of justice. However, his life was not as clear-cut as it may have seemed from the outside. Bobby struggled with his personal demons early on, issues with anger management and a growing sense of frustration with the limitations of his career. Despite his promising start, Bobby's temper had always been a liability, one that he struggled to control. His personal life was also a source of stress, with a marriage that was teetering on the edge and strained relationships with his colleagues, who often whispered about his explosive outbursts. For years, Bobby had found solace in the uniform, using it as a shield to mask his deeper issues. But that shield would soon prove to be as fragile as the resolve he had built up to suppress his emotions. Despite his troubled personal life, Bobby continued to rise through the ranks, gaining more responsibility and the trust of his peers. Yet beneath the surface, his inner conflict was brewing, a boiling pot on the verge of exploding. On November 15, 2017, everything changed. Bobby Cutts was dispatched to a routine call involving a domestic disturbance in a low-income neighborhood. The call itself wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but for Bobby, it became the moment that would shatter his career, his life, and the lives of those around him. The situation quickly escalated when the suspect, a man known to the officers, became combative. He was unarmed but refused to comply with the officers' commands. As Bobby moved closer to subdue the man, the confrontation turned physical. It was a simple arrest that should have been made with minimal force, but Bobby's temper flared. What started as a struggle soon spiraled into something far more tragic. In a split second, Bobby delivered a blow to the suspect's head, knocking him unconscious. What followed was a brutal act of excessive force, one that led to the man's death. The suspect, later identified as Marcus Howard, was pronounced dead shortly after the altercation. His death was ruled a homicide. Marcus had no criminal history, no reason to be violently subdued, but Bobby, in that moment, felt an uncontrollable urge to assert his dominance. The incident was a tragic reminder of how a single decision, fueled by frustration and unchecked anger, can forever alter the course of multiple lives. The investigation into Marcus Howard's death was swift, with the community in shock. The entire event was captured by body cameras, and the footage was chilling. The evidence showed Bobby Cutts using excessive force ignoring the training he had received to de-escalate the situation. His actions were reckless and disproportionate, and the details of his behavior during the altercation revealed a man who had lost control. Bobby's colleagues testified that they had never seen him act so violently before. The defense attempted to argue that Bobby had acted in self-defense, claiming that Marcus Howard had lunged at him, but the video footage told a different story. No weapon was present and Marcus Howard was unarmed. The video clearly showed Bobby's failure to follow protocol, and as the prosecution presented their case, it became clear that Bobby's temper had led him to make a fatal decision. In court, Bobby Cutts Jr. remained stone-faced, offering no emotional response. He was charged with manslaughter, and his trial was a long and painful process for both his family and the victim's loved ones. As the verdict was delivered, Bobby stood motionless, hearing the words he had feared most: guilty. The jury, after careful deliberation, sentenced him to 15 years in prison for his role in Marcus Howard's death. The fallout from Bobby's actions was profound. The community, shaken by the tragic and senseless loss of a life, now faced the question: how could a man sworn to protect his community act so violently? His case sparked a nationwide conversation about the use of force in law enforcement, the mental health of officers, and the consequences of unchecked aggression. For Bobby Cutts Jr., the aftermath was just as painful. His career was over, his reputation ruined, and his family torn apart. His wife filed for divorce shortly after his conviction, unable to live with the emotional burden of his crime. His colleagues, once proud to work alongside him, turned their backs on him, unable to reconcile the man they thought they knew with the one who had taken a life. As of 2025, Bobby is serving his 15-year sentence in a state correctional facility. He has shown little remorse publicly, though there are rumors that he has started to reflect on his actions during his time behind bars. Whether or not he will ever be able to reconcile with the families he hurt remains uncertain. His case continues to be a sobering reminder of the dangers of a system that fails to adequately address the psychological toll on its officers. Case 9.
Former Oklahoma City police officer Daniel Holtzclaw reacting to his conviction. This is back in 2015. Ultimately sentenced to more than 200 years in prison.
Holtzclaw convicted after 13 women accused him of rape and sexual assault. Holtzclaw says he's innocent, and now one of those accusers has changed her story.
News 4's Jessica Bruno is live at the Pardon and Parole Board. And Jessica, the board denying Holtzclaw's request for parole today.
The officer, Daniel Holtzclaw. I didn't do it. I didn't hurt anyone. This is all a lie. Those words, spoken by Officer Daniel Holtzclaw during his trial, were a chilling response to the mounting evidence against him. What could drive a trusted officer, someone who had been given the authority to protect and serve, to commit such horrific acts? Holtzclaw, a once respected officer in the Oklahoma City Police Department, would become the center of a scandal that would shake the very foundation of law enforcement. The lies, the betrayal, the devastating impact, all of it would unravel in one of the most disturbing cases in recent American history. Daniel Holtzclaw seemed to have all the traits of a promising law enforcement officer. Born in 1986, he grew up in a middle-class family in Tecumseh, Oklahoma. His father was a retired police officer, and Daniel had always looked up to him. Holtzclaw's early life seemed unremarkable, but his path would later take a tragic turn. He joined the Oklahoma City Police Department in 2011, a career he seemed well suited for, given his strong family background in law enforcement. His colleagues and supervisors praised his work ethic, and he quickly rose through the ranks. But there was more lurking beneath the surface. Holtzclaw's relationships with others, especially women, were complex and often troubled. His sense of power and control, once fueled by his uniform and the authority it carried, gradually began to shape his behavior. While Holtzclaw's early career was marked by a relatively clean record, there were underlying signs that something darker was brewing. His interactions with women, particularly those in vulnerable situations, were often inappropriate and unsettling. By the time the scandal broke, It was revealed that Holtzclaw had been using his position to exploit women who had either been arrested or were already under suspicion. It wasn't just about authority anymore. It was about control, dominance, and abuse of power. The signs were there, but no one suspected the extent of his actions until it was too late. The night of June 18, 2014, was a turning point that would expose Holtzclaw's disturbing double life. He had pulled over a woman for a routine stop in the area of northeast Oklahoma City. The interaction, which seemed like a regular police stop, quickly escalated into something much darker. Holtzclaw, instead of handling the situation professionally, began a pattern of behavior that would lead to a crime that would later devastate the lives of his victims. Holtzclaw was accused of pulling over multiple women during his patrol shifts, many of whom were vulnerable, including those with criminal histories, drug users, and those who had been arrested. Under the guise of conducting a lawful search, Holtzclaw used his position of authority to sexually assault them. He often intimidated and threatened his victims, telling them that their arrest records would be exposed if they didn't comply with his demands. His abuse continued for months, during which he used his badge as a shield to conceal his crimes. What Holtzclaw failed to realize was that his victims, though silenced by fear at first, began to speak out. Slowly but surely they began to share their experiences, with some women revealing what Holtzclaw had done to them. Their testimonies would form the backbone of a case that would unravel the officer's crimes piece by piece. The investigation into Holtzclaw's actions was prompted by several brave women who had come forward with similar allegations. They had all been subjected to the same type of abuse, and their descriptions of Holtzclaw matched. Surveillance footage, DNA evidence, and testimonies from victims all corroborated the chilling details of his behavior. As more women came forward, the scale of his crimes became clearer. Holtzclaw, however, continued to deny the accusations against him. He maintained that he had done nothing wrong and that the women were lying. His defense team attempted to discredit the victims, but the mounting evidence against him told a different story. DNA samples found on victims' clothing, matched to Holtzclaw, were pivotal in his conviction. Furthermore, surveillance footage from his patrol vehicle showed his movements, confirming his interactions with the victims. The trial was a long and emotional process, with the prosecution presenting a strong case against Holtzclaw. They described him as a predator, a man who used his position to manipulate, coerce, and sexually assault vulnerable women. Holtzclaw's defense, on the other hand, argued that the victims were simply making false claims. But in the end, the jury found Holtzclaw guilty on 18 charges of rape, sexual battery, and other crimes. In 2015, Holtzclaw was sentenced to 263 years in prison, a sentence that would ensure he would never walk free again. His conviction sent a powerful message about the abuse of power within law enforcement and the devastating consequences of violating the public's trust. The impact of Holtzclaw's actions was profound, not just for the victims but for the community and the law enforcement profession. The case brought to light the uncomfortable reality that those sworn to protect often become the perpetrators of violence and abuse. His actions left a lasting scar on the victims, many of whom continue to struggle with the trauma they endured. Holtzclaw's case also raised important questions about the oversight of police officers and the systems in place to protect vulnerable individuals. For the victims, justice was a small solace in the face of the years of suffering they endured. Holtzclaw's conviction was seen as a victory, but for many, the damage was already done. Some victims reported a deep sense of betrayal and horror at the realization that someone they trusted to uphold the law could be the very person responsible for their trauma. As of 2025, Holtzclaw remains incarcerated, serving his sentence in a maximum security prison. His life behind bars is marked by isolation, as he is separated from other inmates due to the nature of his crimes. The case, while serving as justice for the victims, has continued to fuel discussions about the need for greater accountability within police forces, the vulnerability of those under arrest, and the importance of believing victims who come forward with allegations of abuse. Over the years, I've had both positive and negative experiences with the police. While I've met some officers who treated me well, I've also encountered others who left me feeling traumatized. Have you had any good or bad experiences with local police officers? Please leave a comment below. Stay tuned for part 2.